This is the 7th case that Cooler Master has made this year. There's the H500 and the SL600M. It is, in fact, a non-500 numbered case. It's one of the more interesting ones. We saw it at Computex, and it's interesting because it tries to use the bottom-to-top intake path, which is actually, it's done pretty well in the past, so we were excited to try it out with this one. It's not an inverted motherboard layout like the RV02 or anything like that. So all we're doing here is taking what would typically be in the front, in this case 200mm fans, 2 of them, putting them in the bottom and allowing the air to go straight up and out. So very interesting airflow path. We'll have a lot of thermal data on that. And at $200, it's also pretty competitive with a lot of the other $200 cases that have come out this year. This year seems to be pretty big for those higher end cases. So we're gonna look at this one today and see if it's actually worth the price. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's high-end thermal paste and liquid metal. Thermal Grizzly's Cryonaut is an affordable, high-quality thermal compound that doesn't face some of the aging limitations of other pastes on the market. Cryonaut has a thermal conductivity of 12.5 watts per meter Kelvin, focuses on endurance, is easy to spread, and isn't electrically conductive, making it safe to use on GPU dies. Thermal Grizzly also makes Conductonaut liquid metal, which we've used to drop 20 degrees off some temperatures in our delidded tests. Buy a tube at the link in the description below. So this case then, at $200, it's competing with a few things. Let's get those out of the way first. First of all, there are plenty of H5 series cases from Cooler Master itself. So they're competing with their own H500P mesh, about $150. Really good case at that price. The H500M, which compared to the mesh feels a bit expensive, but it's about this price. And then NZXT's got their H700. Everything has an H in it is the rule here. And there are a couple others as well. But Fantex has the Evolve X that we just looked at, the non-upgrade kit. That's $200 as well. So there are a lot of $200 cases this year. And this one, let's go over the main features before we go through the build notes and the really dense thermal section this time. For core features, obviously we got to talk about the front panel and the back first. Now, if you've already typed your comment, it's probably time to scroll down and delete it, unless you want to leave it there to increase our engagement, because no, it is not actually a closed-off front panel with no intake anywhere. It is a closed-off front panel with intake on the bottom. But they've left enough room here, a significant amount of room, where it can actually breathe pretty well. And we tested this, so we have a trick we do. When manufacturers say we use chimney effect or stack effect cooling, and they talk about how it's all just natural convection, hot air rises, all that stuff. What we like to do is we like to take the case and do this. And now that's the front, and that's the back. So all we're doing is testing, okay, so this stack effect, this chimney effect, yes, it's a real thing. Absolutely, there's science to it. Of course, we know that. But the point we always make is hot air rising doesn't really overcome the power of a bunch of fans and directional airflow. And so if you flip this case, does the chimney effect still matter? It is now a horizontal chimney. It's more of an exhaust pipe, really. And so with this air path, as you'll see in our numbers, it performs about the same. And that's because ultimately what you're dealing with is just some big 200mm fans and then the internal case fans pushing the air wherever the air ends up going after that. So the front's closed off, and the more valid reason to this, not one of marketing, chimney, stack effect, whatever cooling, the more valid reason to do that is for noise isolation, because now you're blocking off the only real exit path for noise to where the user's sitting, which is the front of the case. And of course the top if it's on the floor next to you. The back is closed as well, and this is something that maybe should be a little more open than it is. And the power supply then, because the back's closed, the front's closed, and the bottom is occupied by 200mm fans, power supply ends up in the front, and its fan is not really, so the manual kind of recommends installing it in a way that with this PSU, the fan ends up kind of pointing the front panel. It can pull air in, certainly from the bottom. It's fine, the power supplies can take a lot. It's not completely isolated, but a bit better access to air for the power supply would be a decent idea if you're doing anything with like really high wattage systems with long uptime, something like that. Other interesting features, so since Computex, we noted at Computex that we'd like to see the top panel be, have an option to be more breathable, because if you're gonna do bottom to top, the air has to exit somewhere. You can't just take the typical closed off front design and stick it on the top. So they did actually make it so that you can either just sit this kind of elevated or remove it completely, and we'll give them props to that. It doesn't even look that bad when you remove it either. Looks just fine, so completely usable in that fashion. Another thing here, Orienting the CPU cooler is a big item of consideration and one that we tested, but the results are not what you would expect, and we'll leave that for the thermal section. So in this current setup, the last test we did was with the cooler oriented vertically. This is opposite what we normally do, where it's rotated about 90 degrees counterclockwise. So different testing there to look at. We have numbers on that, but you'll want to carefully consider your cooler choices and how you want to orient them, because RAM clearance becomes a bit of a concern, and then how fat the cooler is versus how large the video card is can also be a conflict if you're not going with a CLC. So Cooler Master's done a lot of things right with this case. They've done some things kind of weird, like for example, the rear, because the power supply is in the front, you have to run a cable to the back, and that's fine. The Darkbase Pro 900 does it. We'll talk about that more later, but they really should have a power switch back there, and you can do that pretty easily. You just hook it right into the cable and make it a simple toggle. So that could be easily done. They don't even have to run some crazy cable all the way up here. They don't have to power it with SATA, nothing like that. Just a switch that hooks into the extension cord and tells it, am I open or closed right now? And that's all it needs. But there are plenty of good things too. The looks are very interesting. They've got some cool features up here, like a motion detector for the LED, or for the LED that is over the USB ports. And then the rest of it comes down to a unique approach to cooling and noise and sound isolation. So we'll go through the build notes and then talk thermals. Both the bottom and top of the case have removable fan mounts, although the bottom mount is larger and a bit more difficult to remove. The manual depicts installing a radiator and intake fans on top of this mount and just leaving the two 200mm bottom intake fans in place, which is possible, but we'd consider moving the large fans to the top of the case in such a configuration to better allow for high pressure on the radiator, since you probably have fans with it anyway. The case legs are extra long to allow clearance for the bottom intake, and the bottom of the chassis is lifted 5.5 centimeters off of the table surface. There's support for 360mm radiators at the top or bottom, but installing a full-length radiator means that the PSU cover can't be extended to its full length, which in turn means more restricted cable management. The front panel USB ports illuminate with white LEDs when a proximity sensor is tripped. It's definitely an overkill feature, but it could still be helpful for finding the ports in a dark room or something like that. It's not really that necessary, of course, but it's something unique. We were able to activate the sensor from nearly 30 inches away with movement, so there's a good chance that the LEDs will just stay on during normal use, at least if there's any kind of movement in the room at all. But it's still a cool idea, and it's not on an insanely expensive case, so that's good too. The normal SSD mounts behind the motherboard work just fine, but the combination of 3.5 and 2.5 inch mounts could clutter the interior depending on where they're installed. Sticking them on the inside of the front or back panels are good options, but putting them on the bottom of the case and obstructing the intake fans is not a good option. The metal plate on top of the case is pressed into place with metal pins inserted into rubber washers. The plate can be lifted out and then rested on the post so that there's some extra room to allow for airflow while preserving the overall look of the case, or it can be taken off completely. This is a change that was made sort of live during Computex, where Cooler Master already started making the decision to allow for this semi-modular top panel. It's nice to see Cooler Master offering an option, again, for better cooling. Even if strictly looks-focused users may not take advantage of it, it's good to have there. You never know when you might need an extra couple degrees for some really work-intensive task. The front of the case is dedicated to housing the power supply and is unventilated. This is by design. The back of the case is also sealed as tightly as possible, and both decisions are intentional. Cooler Master wants air to enter the bottom of the case and exit the top with as few complications as possible. The aluminum front plate is secured to the underlying frame with screws, but unfortunately a couple of these screws didn't make contact in our sample and the plate arrived loose. Not a big deal and easy enough to fix. There was also a small piece of plastic broken off from the inside of the panel, so it was shipping damage. It's okay. It's not going to happen to everyone, but we did want to note it. Maybe Cooler Master can make sure it's packed extra carefully for that front panel. Either way though, easy enough to work with and easy enough to retighten if it did arrive loose in your scenario. The floor is lava in the SL600. There's no power supply shroud at the bottom, which would be the usual spot to hide extra cables. And there are 400 millimeters of spinning fan blades instead. The power supply is housed in a two-part cover at the front of the case, which can be adjusted to take up more or less space as desired. We have a lot of loose cables in our case review system, so we set it to the maximum possible size and still found it a little cramped. Cooler Master did a good job of providing plenty of tie points along the front and bottom edges of the case, but this case still requires more care than usual in strapping down every loose end to get the panel on and make sure nothing falls by way of gravity into the fans. One very minor point related to the power supply placement is that there is no easily accessible power switch on the case. The SL600M uses an internal extension cable to reach the power supply, just like the Dark-Base Pro 900 did, but the DBP added a secondary power switch to the rear of the case since the real power supply switch was inaccessible. Cooler Master should have done the same here. It's an oversight. It's a small one, but it is an oversight by Cooler Master and something that we think they could fairly easily improve for the next iteration. Cooler Master mentions the, quote, chimney effect multiple times in their marketing material. The idea is that since hot air naturally rises, it's better to push air bottom to top rather than front to back. The foundation for this is fact, but it is overcome by the power of forced airflow. Can't really beat thousands of RPM with just natural rising of hot air. As we discussed in the RV02 review, it really doesn't matter all that much for cases like these. PC cases are metal boxes that are covered in fans. It completely upsets natural convection. As with the RV02, we tested this by flipping the case onto its front panel and seeing whether that changed anything, and you'll see those results momentarily. Even if it doesn't though, that doesn't mean that the layout isn't beneficial, it's just for other reasons, not that specific reason of hot air rising. We also tested with the top panel popped up, the top panel removed, and in the vertical GPU configuration. We chose to utilize the SL600M's rotatable PCI bracket window to mount the GPU as close to the motherboard as possible for optimal airflow. Getting it closer to the motherboard and farther from the window will increase the amount of breathable air in front of the card, which is counter to what we typically see with these configurations. There are two slots already vertical in the stock configuration, appropriate for liquid-cooled cards, but otherwise rotating the bracket window is a better and functionally identical choice. The main advantage of using these stock vertical slots is that it also allows installing PCI devices in the normal horizontal slot simultaneously, whereas rotating the window means that every usable expansion slot is vertical and requires a riser cable. For the best thermals, it would be ideal to rotate the CPU cooler as well so that it lines up with the case airflow, in theory anyway. And so we decided to rotate our cooler from its standard configuration for a couple of passes of vertical orientation on the cooler as well. Note that we had to change our memory due to memory clearance issues with our cooler rotated this way, but also memory doesn't really impact thermal results in any meaningful way. You're talking less than a watt of difference in most scenarios. So fortunately, this is a temporary change of configuration, but we wanted to note it. Be aware that the CPU temperatures will be more sensitive in these two different types of configurations to your cooler selection than anything else. Compatibility will also depend on your configuration for RAM clearance and should be a consideration when buying. We'll be using our standardized test configuration in the ancillary benchmarks, the cooler oriented front to back for these, and we'll use the vertical cooler orientation only for the CPU and GPU torture tests. Let's start with just the SL600M CPU thermals and then look at comparative data after that. We have a lot of benchmarks for different configurations here, including a, quote, best case configuration with the cooler oriented vertically with a vertical GPU below it. CPU torture testing with the fully stock configuration brought CPU temperature to 62.6 degrees Celsius over ambient. Flipping the case onto the front panel and negating the supposed chimney effect actually brought the temperature down a bit, falling to 59.2 degrees over ambient. This is just outside of our error tolerances. The temperature decrease is a change in impedance to the now front panel. Rather than pulling from a tabletop, the 200mm intake fans were pulling from open air. That's not a huge difference though, and if anything, it suggests that Cooler Master provided sufficient clearance at the bottom of the case to prevent any major problems. Well done by Cooler Master there. Popping the top panel up had approximately the same benefit to CPU cooling, with a temperature of 59.3 degrees Celsius over ambient, while removing it completely slightly lowered it again down to 58.2 degrees delta T. It was the vertical GPU test that provided the most benefit for once, ranking the lowest CPU temperature of all of our tests at 55.5 degrees, for this case anyway. This is because mounting the GPU vertically moves it out of the way of the incoming air, which is more easily able to travel up to the CPU cooler and out the top of the case. Air can get around both sides of the video card, which has an added benefit of providing some backplate cooling as well, because the backplate on this card contacts the back of the PCB and does conduct heat, so we have extra cooling advantages. Keep in mind that all of these tests that we just named were with the cooler in our standard position, front to back. We then ran 2 sets of tests with the cooler removed and reapplied each time, with new paste each time and with a curing period for those tests. We validated the data was accurate by comparing the runs to each other and to our baseline performance. The new tests were with the cooler vertically oriented. In this configuration, the tower cooler is breathing air in straight from the GPU exhaust. Despite being seemingly superior, it actually ends up worse with our specific configuration. We're at 64.6 degrees over ambient, approaching the 90s when considering a 22-degree room temperature, and that drops to 62 degrees with the cover removed. We ran this test again and validated the results. Let's get some shots of the case on the screen again. If you're wondering why it's behaving like this, first keep in mind that every configuration will behave differently, and so this is representative of configurations similar to ours, where you have a tower cooler, not a CLC, and where you have an open-face video card or something similar to this one. It's pretty straightforward otherwise. Although the case would theoretically benefit from the cooler being oriented vertically, something that Cooler Master also suggests, the reality is that the cooler is now breathing in the open-face card exhaust directly. Previously, that exhaust only radiated toward the fin stack, where the higher pressure of the CPU fan would push the radiative heat away from the cooler and toward the back of the case, where it eventually drafted up and out. An open-face video card cooler is among the most common, and those coolers exhaust air out of the fin stack. It's getting the full exhaust of the video card here, rather than whatever drifted around to the front of the cooler previously. Back to the comparative data though, with a different chart. As it is with our configuration, the stock CPU temperature is just bad. It's equivalent to the Antec P8, a case with the cooling capacity of a toaster. Even opening or removing the top panel still leaves the SL600M at the upper end of the chart. The twist is that with the GPU mounted vertically, CPU temperature becomes more acceptable, closer to the stock LANCOOL 1. There are a few reasons for this performance. Again, the CPU is now the most distant device from the fans, rather than a typical configuration in a case where the air hits both the CPU and the GPU at roughly the same time, and it's probably not been preheated by another component. We've got a configuration that creates a much shorter distance to the video card in the SL600M. That's the whole design of the case. That card also partially obstructs air intake to the CPU, it preheats the air, and if it's a longer card, that could cause other issues. The CPU is left with breathing in warmed radiative heat off of the backside of the GPU and circulating some of the heat from the GPU, but the GPU does very well. Stock GPU temperature was 45 degrees Celsius over ambient when loaded. This changed to 45.2 degrees Delta T when the case was flipped onto its front, and is well within margin of error. The intake fans blast the GPU cooler equally well regardless of case orientation, and hot air rising and case orientation really have nothing to do with this behavior. It's fans within inches of the front of the video card. Opening the top panel without taking it off resulted in a temperature of 46.1 degrees within margin of error and test variance. There's functionally no difference for GPU cooling, which makes sense when considering the proximity to the bottom for the card and that the exhaust is really of no consequence to it. This is reinforced by looking at the top removal data, where 45.5 degree result tells us that these do not meaningfully affect GPU performance. We knew mounting the GPU vertically would hurt thermal performance somewhat because it would no longer be directly facing the intake fans, but the jump to 48.4 degrees Celsius Delta T over ambient is reassuringly minor, and it seems plenty of air still makes its way into the cooler. Comparatively, the stock GPU result in the SL600M is a new best on our chart, thanks to the extremely direct cooling from the bottom intake fan. So congratulations to Cooler Master for that placement. The vertical GPU temperature, though slightly worse, was still among the best results we've seen. That means that using the vertical expansion slot closest to the motherboard is still great for GPU cooling and does a decent job at allowing CPU cooling, so we definitely recommend this layout for systems using air cooling that don't need any non-GPU PCIe cards installed. Moving on to 3D Mark, using our standardized setup, Firestrike GPU temperature was just slightly above torture thermals, averaging 46.3 degrees Celsius over ambient. That's, again, technically better than any case on the chart, although the half-X is close enough as to make no difference between the two. CPU temperature during the test was 34.9 degrees, which is pretty high for a benchmark that doesn't really put any serious load on the CPU. That's close to Bitphoenix ENSO territory, which is partly due to the airflow configuration in this case and how the video card is now an item of consideration where you're creating a wall, but also dealing with radiative heat in a more significant way than is typical. For the 3D Mark chart, the case is simultaneously the best and the worst on the chart. The Blender CPU render test raised CPU temperature to 38.9 degrees over ambient under a reasonable workload. The relative performance was better than it was during the torture test because the GPU doesn't generate really much heat at all here, but it's still on par with the mediocre Silverstone KL07 in performance. This test does confirm that the main problem with CPU thermals isn't the heat that it generates on its own, it's also the heat that the GPU generates. All of that extra power has to go somewhere, and it isn't being circulated out because the airflow path is blocked. Again, the vertical GPU mount helps to solve this in some ways and is illustrated in our earlier charts. The GPU render averaged 22.1 degrees Celsius over ambient on the video card, a full degree below the previous best temperature in the half-X. The half-X's CPU temperature during this test was 26.8 for consideration, while the SL600M was 30.8 degrees Celsius over ambient. Moving on to noise, with the fans at max speed, the SL600M reached 37.7 dBA. Given the cooling performance, that's reasonable. It's around the Obsidian 500D or the S340 Elite. The size of the 200mm fans gives the case a bit of an advantage in this area because a bigger fan can spin slower to move the same amount of air through a wider hole. Placing the fans on the bottom also helps here, as does sealing the case in the front and the back, because those are the panels that would most likely impact what the user picks up audibly. Cooler Master's own H500, H500P, and H500M cases use the same fans, but are all marginally louder because of the case layouts. The fans positioned toward the front of the case, where the user is most likely seated. According to Cooler Master's marketing materials, or the review guides, things like that they've sent out, the SL600M is intended to keep, quote, both professionalism and performance intact, while also taking on noise reduction and airflow. Presumably not reduction of airflow. But it's a decent description of what's going on here. The case does definitely look interesting, and depending on how you feel about it, it's probably leaning towards the good side. It's a very unique look. I'll leave it to you whether you like that or not, as that is subjective. So they've done something different there. It does kind of have that sleek professionalism, motif that's going on now. And other than that, with the right layout, the interior of the SL600M can definitely act like a wind tunnel, which is a good thing, while staying relatively quiet. So they've done well there. Component selection is important. So as we've always talked about, case testing is difficult because every single component is a variable and there's no avoiding it. And so for our testing, we found that open face cards positioned vertically actually do really well. If you don't have other PCI devices you need connected, we would recommend that configuration. Tower coolers are a bit rough. So to fix the CPU thermal numbers we had here, what we would recommend is probably put another exhaust somewhere in the case and maybe even leave the cooler oriented that way. Really, you'd have to test it to see how your specific configuration does. But for ours, it would be best to rotate the cooler back the traditional way, contrary to what you might think, because there's no exhaust here. Put a fan up top, and then as it blows the air out, it'll help get rid of it. But it's tough, because really what we'd like to see is still a hole in the back here. I mean, really, closing it off, you get an SSD mount or a drive mount there. But at the end of the day, this back panel being closed is not contributing in a major fashion to noise isolation because it's not going to be near the user at all. So we'd like to see this opened up and then have a fan mount option there instead, because then you can have really good GPU cooler. I mean, the GPU thermals in our charts were the best. So Cooler Master has chart tops now for GPU thermals, and that's great for them. And of course, they've done well there. But the CPU thermal, it's the best and the worst case for cooling simultaneously. CPU thermals, you can conquer them two ways. You can get a CLC in there or something like that, and relative to other cases, it will be warmer, but it'll be cool enough that it's not really that important. Or Cooler Master perhaps consider in the future doing a hole back where it goes here and allowing an exhaust fan, and that would free up a lot of the thermal headroom for the CPU that we lose from shoving all the GPU heat into it. So some items of consideration. We like the case overall. It does fine. It's got a lot of competitors. H700 is a great one to look at. H500P mesh is another good one to look at if you want to save $50 and get some more cooling focus. H500M if you like Cooler Master and want something that's a bit different looking than this. And then Fantex Evolve X is another one to consider. We have reviews of all those cases on our channel. Check them out if you want to see more. But this one's done quite a few things right. And as a consequence of being unique, it's also got some really peculiar thermal characteristics, but ones which you can overcome. Just plan for them and you'll be fine. But this configuration is great for GPU and not so much for CPU. So that's it for this one. As always, thank you for watching. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by picking up something like one of our mod mats or our almost sold out limited edition shirt. And you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, helps out there as well. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.